So we're going to be taking a look at this video today. I got a request to look at this YouTube channel called Spooky Scary Socialist. Particularly this video debunking every anti-communist argument ever. And I'm not going to go through the entire video for a variety of reasons. One of which is, if you notice, he addresses some arguments that I don't care to react to, because it's just a series of rebuttals, and some of these arguments I don't care to defend, and one of them is right here, Animal Farm. He has a whole segment on Animal Farm, which was actually referenced in Mr. Jones. And I actually have not read Animal Farm. I know it's a novel by George Orwell, and it paints communism in a bad light. But I'm not about to read the entire book just so that I can do a rebuttal to a segment in a 40-minute video that was clearly made by a total tanky. And for those who don't believe me that this goon is a total tanky, he actually he only has a few videos, but one of his videos is whitewashing Stalin, Joseph Stalin, the Man of Steel, which I think shows how much of a goon the host of Spooky Scary Socialist really is. So let's get started. I'm only going to react to a few segments in this video. But let's start here. No food. Let's check this out.
The fact that communist countries had famines is mocked again and again, but
oh no, you guys. The fact that communist countries have had famines, it's mocked again and again. Poor communist countries, poor communists getting mocked because the utopias that they set up struggle with food shortages. Now let's go back, let's rewatch it.
The fact that communist countries had famines is mocked again and again, but it ignores the fact that after these famines, countries like the Soviet Union and China accomplished food security for...
So you hear that? It ignores the fact these famines, these multiple famines, some of which had millions of deaths, these horrible famines throughout the multiple famines in the Soviet Union, and I believe China and other communist utopias. If you just look past those famines, if you just ignore the famines, the food security situation in these communist countries wasn't that bad. Although, didn't North Korea, the communist workers' paradise of North Korea, didn't they just have a famine back in the 1990s? It's not like this shit is old news. But I feel like this would be like right here. You guys remember the Super Bowl between the Patriots and the Atlanta Falcons? You can see here the Falcons had a commanding lead going into the fourth quarter. It would be like an Atlanta Falcons fan saying something like, well, if you ignore the second half, the Atlanta Falcons were actually the better football team. Yeah, nobody cares. Because most of the people that mock communists because of the no food LOL, I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but I would imagine that the famines, the horrible famines, are a main reason for this meme. But everyone, just look past the famines, okay? Just look past the famines.
For the rest of their existence. A study called Economic Development, Political Economic System and Physical Quality of Life compares socialist and capitalist countries based on different levels of development, looking at the physical quality of life of both. Data for the study was taken from the World Development Report of the World Bank. Shockingly, it found the daily per capita calorie supply was actually higher in socialist countries than those of capitalist ones. Contrary to the much proclaimed no food, the average socialist citizen was receiving more food than their capitalist counterparts. By the way, the same publication also shows that not only did socialist countries have a higher calorie supply, they also had lower child death rates, higher life expectancy, population per physician, population per nursing person, adult literacy, and secondary education. In fact, the Physical Quality of Life Index, which is a composite and derived measure, shows just how superior socialist countries are to capitalist countries in terms of quality of life. The discussion section...
Oh no, you guys, capitalism has been defeated.
Study goes on to say, historically there is some evidence that the discrepancies between capitalist and socialist nations have reflected varying social policies. All the socialist countries have initiated major public health efforts. These initiatives have aimed toward improved sanitation, immunization, maternal and child care, nutrition, and housing. In every case, the socialist countries have also reorganized their healthcare systems to create national health services based on the principle of universal entitlement to care. These policies have led to greater accessibility of preventative and curative services for previously deprived groups. Expanded educational opportunities also has been a major priority of the socialist nations, as publicly subsidized education has become more widely available. Literacy campaigns in these countries have brought educational benefits to sectors of the population who earlier had not gone to school.
All right, guys, capitalism has been defeated. Now, let's go back here for a second. Let's rewind.
Shockingly, it found the daily per capita calorie supply was actually higher in socialist countries than those of capitalist ones. Contrary to the much proclaimed no food, the average socialist citizen was receiving more food.
Now, right here, he is misattributing this statistic that was based on a study, that was based on a report, a 1983 World Development Report from the World Bank, that says that the calorie supply per person was 130%, but it tells us nothing about the distribution or the consumption of the food. But right here he's saying, actually, based on this statistic, he's misapplying it because he's saying, actually, the people in the Soviet Union received more food. It says nothing about consumption. It just says what the overall calorie supply is divided by the population, which I will get to in a second.
Of their capitalist counterparts. By the way, the same publication also shows that
But then he takes it a step further, beyond the food LOL meme.
Did socialist countries have a higher calorie supply, they also had lower child death rates, higher life expectancy, population per physician, population per nursing person, adult literacy, and secondary education. In fact, the Physical Quality of Life Index,
and here he spikes the football, the Physical Quality of Life Index,
which is a composite and derived measure, shows just how superior socialist countries are to capitalist countries.
Guys, the socialist countries are so superior. Now, let's bring up this study, which you can find by just Googling it. Googling the title. I found the PDF rather easily. Let's bring it up here. Boom. Right here. Right here we have the study that he's talking about. Now, let me begin by saying I don't really give a rat's ass about this study. I have a few issues with it, which you'll see in a minute. But it is worth noting that this study is not the slam dunk that spooky, scary socialist thinks that it is. So let's go down to the chart that he's using right here. And you'll notice that the comparisons between the capitalist and the socialist countries, they're divided into different income and economic groups. And the reason for that, and the authors explain, is they tried to compare apples to apples based on economic development, right? And so you notice this category, high income oil exporting countries. Those countries consist of countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and the UAE, which got really rich because they were exporting oil. But again, this was the early 1980s. They were still rather underdeveloped in those times. And the authors of this study did not think it would be fair to lump them in with the capitalist countries. And I agree, although for different reasons. They didn't think it would be fair to lump them in with the capitalist countries because while they were rich, they were still rather underdeveloped. Although I would not consider countries like Saudi Arabia a beacon of laissez-faire capitalism. But you notice something else going on in this chart. Also, so yeah, for example, let's keep elaborating. The low-income countries. The only low-income country represented by the socialist countries, you look, the socialist countries keep beating their capitalist counterparts in all these charts. But the only country represented in the low-income bracket for socialism is communist China. That's the only country. And the countries that it is compared to in the low-income capitalist countries are countries like Rwanda and Chad and Sri Lanka and I think Tanzania and a few other countries, a few other capitalist countries. Those are the countries that communist China is being compared to in this study. And you'll notice something else. There's a category of high income countries. And if you notice, one, the socialist countries are not represented at all in this high income category. And on top of that, in most of these charts, the high-income capitalist countries beat all of the socialist countries. Infant mortality, it's 10 per thousand in the high-income capitalist countries versus 22 in the socialist, 38 in the low-middle-income socialists. Child death rate per thousand, it's a decimal point to the B power, which if you look down here, B equals less than 1 as reported by the World Bank. So it's less than 1 compared to 1.1, 2.3. Life expectancy in high-income capitalist countries, it's at 75 versus 72 and 68 and 67. All but 2 categories, the high-income capitalist countries beat the socialist countries. Which begs a good question. Who's represented in all of these different income categories? And they show this right here. Let's go up in the appendix. So right here, we have the socialist countries. Again, low income. The low income countries were only represented by China. And there are no socialist countries in the high income category. The highest they go is the upper middle income category, which should not be a surprise because socialist countries, they're not really good at creating much wealth, which I'm sure the Marxists really don't care much about. But the highest they go is the upper middle income, where you get the Soviet Union, East Germany, Hungary, Romania, Poland. That's where the best of the best socialist countries stop. And if you go up to the capitalist countries, the high-income capitalist countries that have dominated all of these measures, all of these metrics, that's the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, Austria, Finland, Australia, Canada, France, Denmark, West Germany. So even West Germany and East Germany, they're not being compared to each other, which I think would be more of a better apples to apples comparison. But because West Germany is in the high income bracket, it's not being compared to West Germany. So the upper middle income, the best socialist countries like the Soviet Union and Poland and East Germany, they're not even being compared to the best of the capitalist countries, which are really just mixed economies, which this study admits. So it's as if the best of the capitalist countries got put in their own professional baseball league, while the Soviet Union and the best of the socialist countries, they're stuck in the minors. USA and the UK and France, they're all Tom Brady and Aaron Rodgers playing in the NFL. While the Soviet Union and East Germany, they're the quarterbacks playing in the XFL, and they're bragging about how they're scoring 10 touchdowns a game and trying to talk shit to Tom Brady, who's counting his Super Bowl rings. Also, another point I want to make. The countries that the upper middle income socialist countries, the capitalist countries that they're getting compared to are countries like Iran and Iraq. This is the upper middle income bracket. These are the countries representing capitalism. Are countries like Iran, Iraq, Algeria, Brazil, Venezuela, Argentina. You know, especially Iran and Iraq. And if you look at the the World Bank. If you look at the World Bank report, you see that countries like Iran and Iraq, which are not capitalist countries even then. This was shortly after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, after the Islamic theocrats took over and renationalized oil and all that goofy nonsense. Not a good representation of laissez-faire capitalism. Also, Iraq was being run by the Ba'ath Party and Saddam Hussein, which was a nationalist socialist movement. Not what I would consider capitalism. But even if you look at the report, you see that Iran and Iraq, they definitely bring down the numbers, because in Iran it was 80, the caloric requirement, it was 81%, whereas in Iraq it was 110%, which brings down the numbers. But even then, you look at the chart, go back up here. The socialist countries still beat the high-income capitalist countries when it comes to daily per capita calorie supply. It's 137 to 131. So you might say, oh, well, when it comes to PQLI, where the high-income capitalists, they beat all the socialist companies. That's where he spiked the football and said, yeah, what now? Clearly they're superior. The fuck they are. But even if you want to throw all that in the garbage, you could still say, well, his whole point was about the, food LOL talking point. And the socialist countries still come out on top, 137 to 131, when it comes to the per capita calorie supply. But that's not really a good metric for a variety of reasons. Let's bring up the World Bank report. If we look right here, this is how they calculate the calorie supply. The daily calorie supply per capita was calculated by dividing the calorie equivalent of the food supplies in an economy by the population. Food supplies comprised of domestic production, imports less exports, and changes in stock. They exclude animal feed, seeds for use in agriculture, and food lost in processing and distribution, right? So the reason why I don't like this metric is because it tells us little about production. It tells us little about distribution. It tells us, it factors this after imports and exports, which I will explain in a second. It tells us nothing about the quality of food or the kinds of food that people are eating. For all we know, people in these countries, they could be eating 3,000 calories a day worth of gummy bears or ice cream. And yeah, it factors this after all of the losses and whatnot, which I guess might be fair. But again, it tells us nothing about the efficiency. It tells us nothing about the technology, which the Soviet Union still struggled with. But let's go back to the video.
In terms of quality of life, the discussion section of the study goes on to say, historically, there is some evidence that countries have brought educational benefits to sectors of...
Whoops.
What a dystopia. How dare these socialists improve sanitation, nutrition, housing, and education?
So again, he tried to use all those metrics to dunk, but again, it wasn't the slam dunk because the Soviet Union was being compared to Iraq and Iran. Well, the best of the capitalist countries had no socialist countries to compare to. Well, China, what was China being compared to again? Here are the countries, the capitalist countries that China is being compared to. Chad, Bangladesh, Nepal, Burma, Mali, Zaire, Uganda, Rwanda, India, Somalia, Tanzania, Haiti, Sri Lanka, Madagascar. Those were the capitalist countries that China was being compared to and beating out in this study. Stonks Boy says, someone get this guy a Pulitzer Prize. Well, considering the 1619 Project and Walter Duranty, it's not really, it's a surprise that I would say is lost its prestige. If anything, doesn't really deserve much prestige.
This is George Orwell's nightmare. I also want to add that if you're skeptical of that study I showed,
the
CIA itself acknowledged that
the CIA itself,
Soviet citizens eat about the same amount of food each day, but that the Soviet diet is more nutritious.
So, I was not expecting a total tanky, like spooky, scary socialist to cite the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, as an authority, as a reputable source on this subject, which, apparently this document is real. Looks like a letter or a pamphlet that says, from the CIA, I looked this up. It says American and Soviet citizens eat about the same amount of food each day, but the Soviet diet may be more nutritious. This is based on a document from 1983. However, when I was looking into this, I found a document from 1985. Whoops, that's not the right one. Right here, it's called USSR, the Food Supply Situation, which, as you can see right here, March of 1985. So I guess if we're going to trust the CIA as a reputable source on this subject, let's check out this report, which, as you can see here, this is in 1985, the food problem, which the late Secretary General Brezhnev termed the most pressing political and economic issue to be addressed in the early 1980s, is thus not likely to be alleviated substantially by 1990. And spoiler alert, the Soviet Union eventually failed. But the experience of the past few years suggests that modest growth in production and continued imports of quality foods, leadership circumspection regarding promises of improvement in consumption, and a continuation of the system of distributing food at the workplace will probably prevent food shortages from becoming the volatile issue they threatened to become in the late 70s and early 1980s. Moscow appears to have blunted the potential serious impact of food shortages with a number of measures that are likely to remain in place for at least several years, whether or not growth and consumption of quality food is at its recent pace. So even in the late 70s and early 80s, the Soviet Union, according to the CIA report, struggled with stuff like distribution, struggled with stuff like quality, struggled with stuff like production. There was a lot of issues with the production and the quality of food. The consumers were far from satisfied in the Soviet Union. And this was, and the CIA report also admits, the early 1980s, it was a huge improvement in terms of supply. In terms of overall supply, per capita calorie supply, it was higher than ever. It was improving. But it still was not that great. On top of that, the people in the Soviet Union had to rely more on bread products. Meat and dairy products were not as readily available at this time, to the chagrin of consumer satisfaction. Even look right here. From late 1979 through 1980, the gap between the demand for and supply of livestock products and some other food appeared to be widening markedly. Consumers increasingly had to endure long waits at food stores, often of several hours, and that suppliers frequently ran out of stocks before all could make their purchases. The reports indicated that the phenomenon of increased queuing was general and widespread, occurring in most republics, in both rural and urban areas, and in cities of all sizes. During this time, several factors seem to have converged, all contributing in varying degrees to widening the gap between demand and supply. So when you look at that CIA report, the picture is not nearly as rosy as spooky, scary socialist likes to paint it in his little video here. And because that PDF document is not text-based, I took some screenshots. Where is it? So food variety. This is also from the CIA report, which also you can find by just Googling. Whenever I post this on YouTube, I will link to all the primary documents below, the PDFs. Right here we see, although more than adequate in calories, the structure of the food supply still does not conform to consumer preferences. Consumers would eat more meat, milk, and milk products, fruits, and vegetables if these were available in greater quantity. A wider assortment within major categories of food would also give consumers greater satisfaction. Choices are frequently extremely limited. For example, when stores offer fresh fruit, the fruit is most often apples. The offerings on vegetable counters often include only cabbage, carrots, and onions. Distortions appear even within some of the general categories of food for which supply is adequate. If you go back up here, the overall improvement in supplies has not displaced the food situation as a front-rank policy issue in the Soviet Union. Although there was some turnaround in 83 and 84, planners still must struggle to maintain balance between consumer purchasing power and the availability of particular foods. So they don't have much choice, or they did not have much choice in the Soviet Union. By the way, he's only using the Soviet Union in that CIA report, doesn't mention all of the communist countries. And then we got the quality of food right here. Quality of food was still an issue. The recent erosion in quality of some foods originated largely in the agricultural sector. For example, as the average weight of animals sold to the state for slaughter dropped, the proportion of bone to meat in the animal carcass rose. Because little bone is discarded during the trimming process, consumers receive relatively more bone in their meat purchases. In addition, complaints about watery milk have become increasingly common. I think also the fat content of butter was rather weak. And it says right here, in many respects, the Soviet food processing industry lags far behind its Western counterparts in application of food technology. Again, does this sound like socialism is winning, according to the CIA reports? And in this part, it talks about how the Soviet Union's General Secretaries Andropov and Chernenko adopted a number of measures to cope with the food situation, one of which was ration meat and other products in short supply. Got more stuff about efficiency and food quality right here. The USSR lagged behind, canning and processed foods. But on top of that, the Soviet Union was heavily reliant on imports. And a reason, now it's not bad to import goods and services from other countries in certain contexts, right? I'm not against foreign trade, but it's worth noting that the Soviet Union had to import food because their production and distribution processes were still rather terrible. And even the United States in the 1970s, the United States always had the opposite problem. Farmers and producers in the agriculture industry throughout much of the U.S. history has overproduced to the point where they're able to export food. The United States is a big exporter of food, and great. Farmers, they make so much food that they can make money. They can make that paper by selling it to customers overseas. Thumbs up, more power to you. Get that paper, farmers. But it's worth noting, so the United States has always been a big exporter of food, meaning that their production of food is really efficient and really well. Whereas the Soviet Union, they had to rely on imports because their production and their distribution sucked, according to the CIA. Although Moscow probably regarded reliance on increased imports of grain and foods as temporary, the continuing problems in the agricultural sector have made imports of grain and foods an important component in the USSR's longer-term growth strategy. The share of net imports in the per capita availability of net farm product grew from 1% in 1970 to 12% in 81 and 82. Unless very large and unlikely gains in production of grain and several other agricultural products occur in the remainder of the 1980s, Moscow will not be able to cut these imports and still obtain planned growth in consumption of meat and several other quality products. And as this report concludes, the USSR's food problem is not likely to be solved by 1990. But the modest growth in per capita consumption we project, along with continued imports of some quality foods, the leadership's reluctance to promise much more than reasonably can be delivered, and a continuation of the system of allocating food at the workplace will probably prevent food shortages from becoming the volatile issue that they threatened to become again in the late 70s and early 1980s. So again, he's basing all this based on one study, based on one report from 1980, conveniently cherry-picked, ignoring the food struggles, the struggles that the Soviet Union, one socialist country, had throughout the 70s, to the point where they had to rely heavily on imports, and even then they were still struggling with long waits at food stores. Consumer satisfaction was not that high. The quality wasn't that great. Let's read the chat. What up, Christ? Thanks for the compliment. As Stonksboy said, blood-sucking kulaks stole all of the food. Christ says, I live in a post-socialist country. Some stuff people tell me is insane, like certain kind of fruits you can only get on Christmas. All right, that's another thing I wanted to bring up. I think the purpose of all this, so again, Spooky Scary Socialist is basing this all on one study based on one report from 1983 conveniently cherry-picked, and then he pivots to only talking about one socialist country. And I think a reason for this is he wants you to ignore all of this stuff, like Boris Yeltsin. You guys remember the story of Boris Yeltsin, who came to, he was a Russian diplomat, Soviet Union diplomat, who came to the United States on a trip in 1989, and he reportedly went to a grocery store in Houston, Texas, and he thought it was a front. He thought that because the grocery store he went into, it had so much variety, it had so much food, well stocked, so much variety, so colorful, and he thought it was a front. He's like, this can't be real. This has to be propaganda. As he said, even the Politburo doesn't have this choice, not even Prime Minister Gorbachev. So not even the People Political Poll enjoyed the grocery stores in the United States. But then you look at the Soviet Union grocery stores. This is what it looked like in a Moscow grocery store in 1989. Moscow, capital of Russia. You'd think they'd be getting the best of the best? I mean, would you rather shop here or Walmart, folks? Look at this. This is what I imagine. This is what spooky, scary socialist. He's trying to blast out of your mind with this one study based on one report from 1983. This is what he wants you to forget about. Because it's easy to say, yeah, this is just anecdotal evidence. I mean, there were probably thousands of food stores throughout the Soviet Union, big country. You know, you can't just make one blanket statement based on this video and based on Boris Yeltsin's experience. Let's look at the study. Well, the study isn't the slam dunk you think it is, and the stat you cherry pick from that study doesn't really paint an accurate picture either. Spooky, scary socialist, you communist klutz. And then, yeah, he went on to cite the CIA, and I just showed you that CIA report that doesn't really paint the food situation in the Soviet Union as rosy as spooky, scary socialists would like you to think.
Hopefully that completely satisfies anyone who still thinks everyone's starved under communism.
And it doesn't satisfy me or anyone with a rational thinking brain.
In the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx states, the theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. Many people have taken this to mean that communists don't want anyone to own anything, even to the point of sharing our toothbrushes communally.
Yeah, that's definitely the sense I get.
Hey, it's my turn. Oh, okay, here you go. Open wide. Or. But anyway, if you actually read the manifesto, literally one second earlier from that quote, Marx says himself,
which I have and I've done videos on. The video, which I'll link to when I get this on YouTube. It's called Socialism. Communism has always been tried right, and that's why it sucks. And I read a lot of excerpts from Communist Manifesto.
the distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property.
Oh, that makes it so much better. So once the communists, once the proletariats, once Poindexter proletariat over here decides whether or not you're part of the bourgeoisie, the ownership class, the ruling class, then he'll decide which property. As long as you're not in the bourgeoisie, you get to have some property.
How communists use private property in this context is different from the...
Of course, he doesn't defend private property. He just says, oh, we're just talking about bourgeois property. But even later in Communist Manifesto, let's bring it up right here. All right, so here we go. We got Communist Manifesto up here. That's not the only part where they mention the abolition of property. As Marx says here, nevertheless, in the most advanced countries, most advanced, the following will be pretty generally applicable. 1, the abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to the public. A heavy progressive graduated income tax, abolition of all rights of inheritance, confiscation of all property of all immigrants and rebels. Communists clearly want to abolish private property, but now he's going to get us on the topic of personal property.
Common definition. Communists don't want to take away your toothbrush or things that you possess. Those are personal property. Private property are things used to make more money and give power to those that own them, like a factory, banks, offices, and infrastructure.
So you hear this, folks. If you own a farm where you grow stuff to sell on the market for money, if you're an entrepreneur and you open a store, or you build a factory, or you open a mechanic garage to fix cars, whatever you do, if you open a business, if you own property in the pursuit of making money, then they'll take it all away. They'll take away your farm, they'll take away your store, they'll take away your factory, they'll take away your workshop, because how dare you make money? But on the bright side, they'll still let you have personal property. Well, like they'll let you have a toothbrush and a blanket. So again, if you own a farm or a factory, they'll happily take that away, because how dare you make money? But at least they let you keep a toothbrush and a blanket. Wow. Sounds like heaven. Now, as to the issue of personal property, did a whole video on personal property and how it's an anti-concept meant to obliterate the concept of private property. Because after all, personal property, it's clearly not private property, because the central planners, Poindexter proletariat over here, he's going to be the one that decides which personal property you get to keep and not keep. And so, yes, communists do want to take your stuff. Doesn't this sound wonderful, folks? All right, let's jump over here. This is the last. I'm going to end on this section. Communism killed 100 bazillion people. Let's check this out. So he's going to tell us that, what? No people died under communism? What are we going to get here?
I've already dealt with the topic of death counts, specifically concerning Stalin, in a previous video. Needless to say...
By the way, he only focuses on the death counts pertaining to Stalin's Great Purge. Not even all the deaths under Stalin, including the famines and whatnot. It's mainly about the Great Purge in his video about Stalin.
When scholars looked at actual archival evidence released
from
the Soviet Union, they found that death counts were actually much lower than what was previously estimated. The paper, Victims of the Soviet Penal System in the Pre-War Years...
And this is all he bases his argument on, is this one paper that was based on primary documents that came out after the fall of the Soviet Union, KGB press releases, and accounting documents throughout the Soviet Union. Now, some Russian historians have taken issue with this paper right here. They said, while some of the because the issue that Spooky Scary Socialist has is some people estimate the Great Purge death count to be upwards of 60 million, maybe 20 million, maybe even 10 million. And the critics of this paper even say that, like, yeah, maybe some of the numbers are over-exaggerations. But the problem with this paper is that it puts too much emphasis and faith in the accounting documents from the KGB, as you can see right here. And as I mentioned earlier in this critique, there was one document that where prisoners did not die, they did not go free, they did not flee, were not transferred to other places, but at the same time they disappeared. And what happened? They ceased to be available. There were none. They were gone. Where? How? Flew away. Taken to heaven. Where did these mysterious numbers go? Right? And even if we look at the report, which I found, and you can find for free, even if we're about to take this report on face value, and again, this report is all based on the Great Purge in the Soviet Union under Stalin. It doesn't mention all the other deaths that occurred under Stalin. It doesn't mention other repressions in the Soviet Union history, like Lenin's Red Terror. It doesn't mention all of the deaths in communist China under Mao Zedong, and the Great Leap Forward, and the Cultural Revolution, and the landlord classicides in China. It doesn't mention all of the suppression that happened in East Bloc countries like Hungary when they tried to have a revolution, and in East Germany and whatnot. It doesn't mention all the other. It doesn't mention the Cambodian genocide under the Khmer Rouge, and all the other deaths in hellholes like North Korea and Cuba and Vietnam. So this is all about the Great Purge under Stalin, which, if we're going to take this paper at face value, it looks like it narrows it down from, say, 20 million to 10 million down to roughly 2.3 million, which is still a lot. But even then, the author says this can't be taken as an exact number. There may have been overlap and double counts. Also, at the same time, there were a lot of, on the other hand, it does not include several suspected categories of death in custody. It does not include, for example, deaths among deportees during and after the war, as well as among categories of exiles other than the kulaks, like how they have kulaks in quotes. So it's roughly, he pretty much got the number down to 2.5 million. And even if you look at the charts up here in the paper, executions, 800,000 executions. Looks like 600, almost 700,000 executions in 1937 and 38 alone. According to a press release of the KGB, 786,000 persons were sentenced to death for counter-revolutionary and state crimes by various courts and extrajudicial bodies between 1930 and 1953. It seems that 681,000 people, or 87% of the number, for this 23-year period were shot in the head. Were shot in 1937 and 1938. And, it's hard to tell. So, also between 1937 and 1939, the population of the Gulag system in the Gulag camps increased by over 1 million prisoners. So even if we're to take this paper at face value, it's still a lot. And that's all he really talks about. That's like the only debunking he does, as he gets the number from 60 million all the way down to 2.5 million. That's still a lot of people. And again, it doesn't mention all of the other people not purged by Stalin in the Soviet Union and in other communist countries.
Found that many of the previous estimates of historians were based on guesses, rumors, or extrapolations from isolated local observations. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I covered in the full video.
He doesn't go into too much detail in the other video either.
But the point is, the death count of communism, which includes Stalin, tend to be overblown and exaggerated to gain more attention.
See, now notice what he does here. He does this non sequitur.
A lot of the 100 million stuff comes from the big black book of communism, which was deliberately bloated to come to a nice round number. Methodology for these things is also highly suspect, as sometimes they can go as far as counting someone who stubbed their toe in a communist country.
Oh, okay, so the millions of deaths you hear about from all these communist countries, it was just people that, stubbed their toe. So there you go. Okay, because the numbers of Stalin's Great Purge may have been over-exaggerated by some historians, all the deaths attributed to communism must therefore be over-exaggerated. Because it's all a conspiracy by the ruling class, you guys. Of course, when it comes to the Great Leap Forward in China, the Cultural Revolution in China, the Cambodian genocide, and all the other deaths, all the other horrors, well documented. It's not just the big book of communism or the black book of communism. I've never read it. But yeah, it's pretty well documented.
Another victim of communism.
And I think at some point in this video, I can't remember, it was either in this or in Stalin's video, he actually does victim blame the kulaks and other victims, saying, oh, well, the people were hoarding their food and they weren't willing to share.
Certain peasants also hoarded grain and slaughtered their own livestock to fight the collectivization movement. Wow.
Because if some communist goons want to come take your farm, you better just give it up and don't even try to fight back, I guess.
Oh, I can't believe communism would do this. This conversation...
Just stop being an enemy to the revolution, you guys. Jeez.
About victims of communism, of course, ignores the millions of deaths under capitalism from poverty, hunger, exposure, and imperialist war.
Oh, there we go. So it pales in comparison to all the deaths under capitalism. And this is bullshit because he makes a package deal between capitalism and imperialist wars. And yeah, a lot of the more capitalist countries, I've admitted this in other videos, like the UK and the US and perhaps others, have engaged in wars that they should not have engaged in. and it's very costly for the free people in these countries. It costs a lot of tax dollars. Costs even more importantly, it costs lives, American soldiers' lives, putting men in danger. Shackles the economy to a certain, if not large extent. So I would say that any war not fought in self-defense and individual rights on behalf of the country, on the behalf of the individual rights of the people within a country, those are an abandonment, if not rejection, of capitalism. And then he talks about, what about all of the deaths from poverty and hunger and capitalism? Well, capitalism inherited poverty, whereas socialism and communism, they create and prolong poverty, literally. If you escape poverty too much, you're going to be part of the ruling class. Then again, what do I know? I'm just speaking out in favor of my class interests, you guys. What do I know?
We have more than enough resources to give food, water, and treat curable diseases for everyone.
We have more than enough resources, as if, all resources are presumably collectively owned and no new resources are created.
In the world, it's capitalism that refuses to provide these things because they aren't profitable.
Notice how much contempt he had in his voice when he said, capitalism won't produce this, won't give this to people because it's not profitable. Notice the contempt in his voice for the profit motive. He really seems pissed off that someone would have the audacity to want to make and produce goods like food and water and sell them for a profit. And when you break it all down, that's what it's all about. Hatred of profits, hatred of wealth creation, hatred of trade, free trade, whatever free trade is left, that is, and win-win transactions. Because again, if you win from a trade, you must have exploited the other party. And there's nothing wrong with making profits. There's nothing wrong with making profits, folks. If someone wants to find ways to make goods and services like food and water more affordable, people want to make products that make my life better, perhaps even reinvent some wheels, and along the way make some fat stacks, make some money while doing so, then I say that's absolutely wonderful. And just think about it at the end of the day. What society would you rather live in? Would you rather live in a society that respects your rights to pursue happiness, pursue values in your own self-interest? Live in a society where you're allowed to maximize your wealth and where other people are free to make goods and services and try to appeal to your rational self-interest in exchange for your money? Would you rather live in that society, or would you rather live in a world where Poindexter proletariat over here live in Poindexter proletariat's utopia, where he and his goons will seize your means of production, they'll take your farm, take your store, take whatever they think belongs to the community, and they might let you keep a blanket or a toothbrush. And I would say it's rather telling that this commie klutz seems way more bothered and upset by a business making money than he is at brutal dictators purging and starving people. But hey, I guess you gotta break a few eggs to make an omelet. Am I right, my comrades?
I used to say this all the time when people, back when Russia was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and they'd say, "Oh, but aren't you so glad that you're in America?" I said, "Well, I know a lot of Russian filmmakers, and they have a lot more freedom than I have."
Is that the case, huh? Huh, George?
To do is be careful about criticizing the government. Otherwise, they can do anything they want.
Oh, just don't criticize the government. Don't criticize communism or Marx or the government. As long as you don't do that, you can make whatever movie you want. Do you get to keep all the profits, George? Like all of the billions of dollars you made off of Star Wars, George?